Whenever Nintendo releases a new console, hackers usually aren't too far behind, and the 3DS is no exception. Just like with their previous consoles, it immediately became a high target the moment it was released back in early 2011. But after learning from their failed attempts to protect the Wii, Nintendo substantially upped their new handheld security. This led to a huge back and forth struggle, not only between Nintendo and hackers, but also among the hackers themselves. One that, in all honesty, I'm really excited to talk about today. So, without further ado, welcome to Tech Rules. The history of 3DS hacking has a rather unique and, frankly, pretty early start. We're talking shortly after release early, thanks to the 3DS's backwards compatibility with games from the original Nintendo DS. The DS was already conquered by hackers long ago, in the form of flashcards that could run both backups of retail games and, of course, awesome homebrew applications made by the hacking community. So, already having custom code running on the system was cool and all, but what did that mean for the rest of the system? Well, not much, and the reason for that is because of how the 3DS handles these DS carts in the first place. Because of some similarities between the hardware of the two devices, the 3DS is actually able to set up a virtual DS to run the game. It's not emulation, it's more like a DS built into your 3DS. We'll call this DS mode, and while the way it's set up provides near perfect compatibility with DS games, there's not much we can do with it. Your DS games are ran within the confines of DS mode. You can gain control of it, but then what? From this virtual box, there's no way to access any of the, 3DS parts of the 3DS. But hey, you still had all your favorite DS games on one cart, ROM hacks, and lots of cool homebrew that was made for the DS. We're talking emulators, plenty of custom games, useful tools, and ports of classics like Lemmings and Doom. It was certainly better than nothing. It was around this time that Nintendo was passively attempting to block these flashcards, but their half-hearted attempts were easily bypassed by a flashcard update from the companies that made them. And while they were at it, they made sure to advertise that their flashcards worked with the 3DS. In the process, though, they seem to have made it look like it runs 3DS games, didn't they? I mean, they're not lying, their cards do work with a 3DS, I guess, but you know exactly what they were trying to imply with this. Of course, this obviously doesn't mean progress wasn't being made on the 3DS front, but as with any recently released system, hackers were nowhere near gaining enough understanding and control of the 3DS to run homebrew, and being able to take control of the system is a goal that's usually only reached much later, often nearing the end of the system's lifespan. Plus, the installation usually requires either a painstakingly complicated process to go through or direct modifications to the hardware itself. But it only took 2 years for something to happen to the 3DS. In late 2013, a company called Gateway released a flash cart that not only worked on the latest versions of the 3DS, but actually played backups of 3DS games. No gimmicks, no hardware modifications, it just worked. And this led to an interesting conflict. See, I already mentioned the hacking community's driving force behind hacking a game system. Their primary interest is a powerful device that they have full access to, whether it be making their own games in useful homebrew or modifying already existing games. But there's another, very present driving force that persists with every new console release. You guessed it, piracy. This group of people aren't just comprised of hackers and enthusiasts. Rather, they consist of hundreds of thousands of pirates whose motives can range from those who like to try before they buy or live in a country where games are expensive, to those who refuse to even pay a penny for video games. An extremely small amount of them are actually hackers, and while they do care about the progress of device hacking, it's usually only because they want free games. This creates a sort of conflict of interest, because while hacking enables piracy, most people who hack game systems are against it. It's not their goal to enable it, and at times they will take drastic measures to ensure it doesn't happen as a result of their work. This usually meant that, at least around this generation of consoles, homebrew paved the way for hacking, and piracy only eventually happened as a result of that work. And that's what made this situation so interesting. Gateway's main purpose was to enable piracy, and they weren't shy about this. In fact, Gateway actually managed to do next to nothing for the homebrew community. Despite its ability to run official games, running a homebrew on it was basically impossible. It was a situation where piracy was leading the hacking scene, and Gateway was reaping all the benefits. And as you probably guessed, they couldn't be less interested in furthering the hacking scene. According to some numbers crunched by Wololo.net, they ended up making millions of dollars in their prime. Needless to say, they did not want anyone finding out how it worked. So let's talk a little about how it worked. Gateway actually came with not one, but 2 carts. A red one and a blue one. The only purpose of the blue cart was to allow you to launch the red cart that actually did all of the work. So, what's the secret? The blue cart is actually just a normal Nintendo DS flash cart that does something kinda clever. I said before that there was no way to mess with the 3DS from DS mode, and while that's kinda true, there are a few ways they still directly communicate with each other. One of them being the DS profile. The profile on the DS consists of your name and a message used for online play. Normally you would change this in the DS settings menu, but obviously the 3DS doesn't have one. Instead, you fill out this information in the 3DS settings app, and the 3DS changes it accordingly for DS mode. This is where Gateway's IMSET exploit comes into play. Since it's trivially easy to take control of DS mode, the blue cart does something kinda devious here. It changes the DS profile information to an extremely long set of characters. If someone were to then go to their DS profile settings, the 3DS would retrieve that long string and essentially become overloaded with information. And from this vulnerable state, you can run custom code. For example, code to run an unauthorized 3DS cart. This might make some of you think, well, if people figured out how it worked, why not use the same method to run homebrew? To put it simply, the IMSET exploit is just something we'll call an entry point. And while finding an entry point is the door to running unauthorized code, that's literally all it is, the door. From here, you'll need to research and discover other oversights in the system's programming to reach your goal, called an exploit chain. In fact, people actually knew of this exploit before Gateway started using it. And while it was a great entry point, the rest of Gateway's code wasn't very useful for making homebrew actually work very well. Of course, the thing about the 3DS, and pretty much every system coming out around this time, is it got frequent firmware updates over the internet. So it's no surprise that the exploit was eventually patched out in a firmware update a few months later, making Gateway inaccessible. This put Gateway users in a predicament. They could update and lose access to Gateway, or they could stay on their current firmware and lose access to the eShop and basically all of Nintendo's online services. Gateway's solution to this problem? Simple. Do both. What I mean is they released an update to their carts that added a new feature. It provided the option to copy your entire firmware to your SD card and run it from there. This is called EmuNAND, short for emulated NAND. The idea is that users could keep their system NAND on the old firmware that could use Gateway, and then you could keep the EmuNAND on your SD card on the latest version for online services. That's right, it was literally dual booting on the 3DS. This was going to be Gateway's strategy as they waited for a new entry point to be found that they could take advantage of. But that doesn't mean everything was going perfectly for Gateway. They had new competition to deal with in the form of clones. Numerous clones of Gateway were being released using their codes and methods, and Gateway, being, proudly for profit, was not very happy about this loss of revenue. The way they decided to approach this problem was, we'll say aggressive. The release notes for their new update stated that they added many stability improvements, which is apparently Gateway speak for malicious code. The code in question looks for changes in the software, and if any are found, it assumes the card it's running on is a clone and self-destructs. Thing is, it doesn't just stop at killing the card, it bricks the entire system running the card, rendering it unusable. When understandably angry owners of bricked 3DS's confronted Gateway, they blamed it on the faulty hardware of their competitors. This obviously goes way farther than just protecting their code, this is straight up sabotage. If they could force all of the clone cards to destroy 3DS's, the reputation of the clones would plummet to the ground, and Gateway would once again be the only safe and trusted method to run 3DS backups. Well, they would've, if their amazing code didn't trigger on actual Gateway carts too. Yeah, not even legit owners were safe from Gateway's bloodthirsty rampage. Anyway, hackers eventually took a look at the code and confirmed, yeah, the bricks were very intentional. The end result of this chaos was countless bricked systems, and Gateway promising to fix any systems that their legit cards ruined. I would like to say this ruined their company, but it didn't. Sure, they basically just shot themselves in the foot, but what could you do about it? Stop using Gateway? Like it or not, their flashcards were the only really exciting thing happening in the hacking scene at the time. Not to mention the only way to play ROM hacks or even play games outside your region. However, it soon turned out that this wouldn't be true for much longer. Fast forward to a few months later, late March 2014. A talented hacker and programmer named Smea updated his blog, talking about a new exploit he discovered called SSS-Pwn. This exploit would not only provide access to actual homebrew, but it would work on the latest firmware. Smea had something big, an unpatched, extremely useful exploit, so, understandably, he wanted to be careful about how he used it. If he were to release this exploit at any point, Nintendo would immediately patch it and it would never work again. The longer he holds on to it, the more firmware versions it would work on. On top of that, any finding that enables homebrew is also eventually going to enable piracy. Interestingly enough, however, the blog post actually mentions that this exploit cannot, by itself, enable piracy. Meaning that while piracy is still most likely an inevitability with this exploit, it would require more than just the exploit to actually achieve it. It makes you wonder how Smeya would have handled the exploit if that weren't the case. Anyway, the post went on to say that while he wasn't ready to release it just yet, he did want to get it out to trusted homebrew developers that would help create a successful release for the exploit. Eventually, things went by smoothly, and Smeya tweeted out that the homebrew loader was almost ready for release, and that you would need a specific game to use it. He did not, however, reveal what game it was just yet, most likely out of fear that scalpers would buy up the game and sell them at ridiculous prices. I say that because there wasn't really any fear that the exploit could be fixed without a software update. The company that made the game already went out of business, and a patch was unlikely. Unfortunately, Nintendo did actually manage to stop the exploit and loader from being released on time, but not in the way you'd think. During a Japanese Nintendo Direct presentation in August 2014, Nintendo announced that, in a few months, they were going to release a new 3DS model called, well, the new Nintendo 3DS, sporting more buttons, another stick, amiibo compatibility, and various upgrades to the hardware. This prompted Smeya to hold on to the exploit a little while longer. The reason was pretty obvious. If the exploit were to be released on time, Nintendo would have had plenty of time to ensure it didn't work on their new 3DS. The only way to ensure that the new model would be hackable was to delay the exploit a little while longer. This was, of course, met with some backlash from the community, with Smeya saying that he was sorry, but he did not want to make any rash decisions. Time passed, the new 3DS came out in Japan, and the exploit was confirmed to work. In November, Smeya prepared for release once again as he finally revealed the game to be used as the entry point. Cubic Ninja was certainly an interesting game, one where you move the ninja by tilting your 3DS. But, maybe not exactly good. Because of its poor critical reception and general unpopularity, it was pretty easy to find this game for under $10, making it an excellent and accessible entry point for SSS Pwn, or as it's now being called, Ninjax. For a few hours. Everyone immediately started buying Cubic Ninja, and the game skyrocketed in popularity on shopping sites. Copies started selling out left and right, and the copies that were still in stock were being sold for crazy prices. Before the day was over, Cubic Ninja was hitting lists of hottest 3DS games worldwide. It wasn't long before the game was nearly impossible to find, and the Japanese digital version was taken down from the eShop. And in case you were wondering, yes, Gateway users were perfectly able to pirate the game and take advantage of the exploit. That is, if you were lucky enough to still be on a firmware version that supported it. The entry point for Ninjax was pretty straightforward. This might come as a surprise to you, but this poorly received 3DS game didn't exactly have the best programming. Cubic Ninja featured a mode where you could design your own levels and have others play them. The chunks of data that make up these custom levels are supposed to be a certain size, but the game never actually checks to make sure that they are the right size. Basically, there's nothing stopping you from taking a custom level and adding as much extra data to these chunks as you want. And if you add more than the game can handle, well, there's your entry point. The release of Ninjax was a milestone for 3DS hacking. Not only was Ninjax the first exploit to make homebrew possible, but it worked on every 3DS on the latest firmware. The real hacking scene was taking off, and the iron grasp Gateway had over the 3DS was gone. Or at the very least waning. As Smeya promised, the nature of the exploit he used made piracy practically impossible, and since the exploit was just released, it would be a bit before a lot of impressive homebrew started showing up. Until then, flashcards still had the upper hand. Speaking of flashcards, it's worth mentioning that a pretty impressive one was released during all this Ninjax hype, Sky 3DS. The difference between Gateway and this new flashcard was its approach to running backups. While Gateway relied on exploits to run unauthorized games, Sky 3DS's method of choice was to replicate a legit game card entirely, allowing it to run on pretty much any firmware. The card itself had a red button on it. To switch games, you would press this button, and Sky 3DS would switch to the next game loaded on the cart. This method of backup loading had issues though. The main one being it had to deal with the same restrictions of a real 3DS cart. Any tampering and the 3DS would no longer be fooled. This meant no ROM hacks, no cheats, and no games from outside your region. For those reasons, it was still better to own a Gateway card, provided your system could still run one. Not to mention the card had this weird restriction where it could only play 10 games. And just so we're clear, I don't mean 10 games at one time. I mean 10 games ever. Sky 3DS keeps track of what games you've played on it, and once you've reached 10, it refuses to let you play anymore. Want to play more games? Buy another cart. Naturally, this arbitrary limitation didn't go well with the community, and after some negative reception, lo and behold, a new version came out. This one had a blue button, which was apparently a sign the cart didn't have the stupid 10 game limitation. Anyway, time passed, and 2014 wrapped up with a huge step forward to a more open and robust hacking scene for the 3DS. Gateway, still being decently relevant at this point, kicks off their new year by releasing a new update for their flashcards, called Gateway Ultra. Yeah, I forgot to mention, Gateway likes to name their version updates occasionally for some reason. Last version was Omega. I guess it's a marketing thing? I don't know. So what was so ultra about Gateway Ultra? Well, simply put, they had an exploit for 9.2 that didn't require a game like Ninjax did. And that was great, but it would have been even better if the latest firmware at the time wasn't 9.4. But trust me, that did not stop them from going out of their way to protect their exploit. The code itself was encrypted and obfuscated greatly. A good portion of the code was just useless garbage designed to make it even more difficult to reverse engineer. This is where Yifan Lu comes in. That name might sound familiar to those of you who followed the Vita hacking scene, where he was an active hacker in the scene and eventually became part of Team Molecule. But I guess he was looking for a change of pace because he was checking out a 3DS exploit this time around. Not only did he completely reverse engineer it, but he also made a very nice write-up on it. That's a pretty impressive change of pace, don't you think? In case you were wondering, the entry point this time around took advantage of a known vulnerability in a browser engine, specifically WebKit. Most big-name browsers like Chrome and Safari had already fixed it at that point, but I guess Nintendo hadn't gotten around to it yet. More importantly though, the entire exploit chain itself contained some very useful information that helped out the hacking scene quite a bit. Thanks, Gateway Ultra. It wasn't very long after these findings that RX Tools was released, a series of very useful, albeit old 3DS only, tools made by GBA temp user Roxas75. RX Tools' main feature was that it could give you access to Gateway's Immunan solution without the need of an actual Gateway cart. Basically, you could keep your 3DS on 9.2 for homebrew access and still be able to boot into the latest firmware on your SD card. However, RX Tools didn't have its own way to easily boot up homebrew. To do this, its custom firmware would have needed to do something about signature checks. This part is a bit complicated, but I'll try my best to keep it simple. In this context, a signature is something that your 3DS checks for when attempting to run games and apps. If it's not there, or something's wrong with it, the app doesn't run. Each signature is unique to the program it was made for, and they're impossible to create without the proper tools. Tools that, unfortunately, only Nintendo had. To run your own apps straight from the home screen without relying on any additional exploits like Ninjax, the signature checks would have to be patched out entirely. However, doing this would create a different problem: piracy. If RX Tools were to remove signature checks, any program could be executed on the 3DS, including games downloaded from the internet. It's a bit of a moral dilemma. Sure, this would take away Gateway's main feature and significantly hurt their piracy-fueled profits, but I'm sure a good portion of hackers wouldn't want to be responsible for directly enabling a method of piracy. It's not like someone can just make their own version of this custom firmware that does the job either. RX Tools, and by extension the custom firmware RX Mode, was closed source. Its source code was not public, and Roxas75 didn't want any unauthorized changes to be made to it. A few months later though, someone had leaked information on how to patch signature checks on Pastebin, a website designed to share code and text in general. Who did it? Nobody knows. But it probably wasn't meant to be public. This information was quickly put to use in the form of Pasta CFW, the first custom firmware to enable custom apps straight from the home menu, and it was open source to boot. That being said, it didn't have any of the cool features that RX Tools had, which is probably what led to RX Tools being reverse engineered and modified to add these signature patches in. As you might have imagined, Roxas was not happy about this, and it led to a lot, and I mean a lot, of drama over the course of a few days. I'll spare you the details and say that it ended with Roxas finally making RX Tools open source and adding in signature patches himself. And with that, Roxas announced his departure from the 3DS hacking scene. He stated that he wouldn't blame himself for the mistakes he made too much, and gave ownership of the RX Tools project to the Pasta team, as he said his goodbyes. And there you have it. There was now custom firmware that ran homebrew and backups without the need to support Gateway or any other flashcard business for that matter. At this point, there wasn't much room for debate. Gateway was no longer the king of the 3DS scene, and homebrew was paving the way once again. That pretty much covers the juicy bits of the hacking scene's early history. From here, there were only improvements. For a while, 9.2 became the firmware to be on so you could run all these amazing things, and methods to downgrade to 9.2 were being made all the time. Eventually, ARM9 loader hacks came out, and that exploit persisted across system updates. Usually you could be on the latest firmware while still maintaining your hacks. Provided you had a way to get it on there. And then Boot 9strap was released, which did everything ARM9 loader hacks did and then more. It also may or may not be actual witchcraft. Everybody uses a sleek custom firmware called Luma 3DS now that's as useful as it is easy to use. And all of this is installable on the latest firmware thanks to Sudoku. Not joking, it's literally possible because of an oversight in DSiWare games like Sudoku. Not only has Nintendo struggled to patch these hacks out, but they've been outright leaving the oversights in with releases of newer 3DS models. It's pretty safe to say the 3DS has been cracked wide open now, and I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit of how it happened. Oh, but some of you might be wondering what happened to Gateway after all these breakthroughs. Well, after many failed attempts to stay relevant, they announced the release of their new flash cart, Stargate, which does, well, less than the current custom firmware already does, for like $80. And to be honest, I'm not even sure how well it works because, well, nobody bought one. Frankly, nobody cares. Anyway, I have something important to say. There's a chance this video may have inspired some of you to hack your 3DS and check out all the homebrew and neat new content it provides. If so, cool. But I have a word of warning. Whatever you do, please, 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 do not follow a video guide you found on YouTube. Video guides are pretty much always outdated, and they usually leave out important details that add unnecessary dangers to the process. To make it worse, a lot of YouTubers like to, for whatever reason, modify the files used to hack the 3DS even though they really don't know what they're doing. There are some great resources out there, like the website 3ds.guide, that are thorough and up to date. If you use a video guide, you're only putting your 3DS in unnecessary danger. Anyway, that's the early days of 3DS hacking. Shoutouts to the people in the 3DS hacking scene who usually document their findings pretty well. Actually, I have to especially thank one person in particular called Zoogie, who made an extremely helpful timeline on GBA Temp a few years back. If I had found that sooner, this video would have been much less of a pain to make. If you guys have any suggestions for future videos, leave a comment or something, contact me on Twitter. Also, feel free to tell me any mistakes I've made as well. I'll put the corrections in a pinned comment down below. I've already got more videos planned, so I hope you keep an eye out in the future for more tech rules.